Hey everyone, welcome back to another journey into the strangest corners of human consciousness. Tonight we're diving into something that'll probably make you question everything you think you know about the line between human and animal awareness. We're exploring the bizarre, documented accounts of people throughout history who dreamed they were animals and woke up fundamentally changed by the experience. So before you settle in for the night, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe if you genuinely enjoy these weird historical rabbit holes we go down together. And I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Drop your location and time in the comments. It's always fascinating to see our global community of insomniacs and history lovers checking in from every corner of the world. Tonight we're talking about medieval peasants who spent entire nights as wolves and couldn't shake the predatory instincts when they woke up. Modern individuals who lived entire lifetimes as birds in their dreams and found themselves trying to fly when morning came. Ancient shamans who claimed their animal dreams weren't just visions, but actual spiritual transformations that changed their fundamental understanding of what it means to be human. And here's the thing, if you fall asleep halfway through, that's totally fine. Actually, that's kind of the goal here. But honestly, some of these stories are so strange that you might find yourself staying awake longer than planned, wondering if you've ever had dreams that felt more real than reality itself. Anyway, let's start with what might be the most documented case of animal transformation dreams in medieval history, a story that involves a French monastery, a monk with an unusual problem, and the question of whether souls can temporarily inhabit different bodies. So picture this, it's 1347 at the Abbey of St. Denis, just outside Paris, and Brother Thomas, a quiet, bookish monk who spent the last 15 years copying manuscripts and tending gardens, has just woken up from what he initially thinks is just another nightmare about wolves. Except this time, he's not running from the Wolf. He is the Wolf. I mean, imagine going to sleep as a devout medieval monk and waking up with the distinct memory of hunting deer through moonlit forests, feeling raw meat between your teeth and experiencing the world through senses, so acute you could track a rabbit from miles away just by scent. That's not exactly the kind of spiritual revelation they teach you about in monastery school. Brother Thomas was what you might call the poster child for medieval monastic life. Born into a family of minor nobility somewhere near Reims, he'd been given to the church at age 12, which was pretty standard practice for families who had too many sons and not enough land to go around. Thomas had embraced religious life with the kind of enthusiasm that made other monks slightly uncomfortable. While his brothers were sneaking extra portions of bread or complaining about the 4 a.m. prayer sessions, Thomas was genuinely excited about copying illuminated manuscripts and debating theological fine points with anyone who would listen. For 15 years, Thomas had lived a life of almost perfect routine. Up at dawn for lauds, work in the scriptorium until midday, tend the monastery gardens, evening prayers, sleep, repeat. His biggest daily excitement was usually discovering a particularly elegant piece of Latin prose in whatever text he was copying, or successfully grafting a new variety of apple tree. He was the kind of monk who actually enjoyed silence, who found genuine peace in repetitive prayer, who could spend hours contemplating the spiritual significance of geometric patterns in manuscript decorations, which is why what started happening in 1347 was so completely out of character that it took weeks for anyone to take it seriously. The dreams began on the feast day of St. Bartholomew, which Thomas would later remember, because he'd spent that evening in the chapel praying for protection from the plague that was starting to spread across France. The Black Death hadn't reached their region yet, but refugees from infected areas brought stories of entire villages being wiped out in a matter of days. Thomas had been having anxiety dreams about death and suffering, pretty standard for monks during a plague outbreak. But this dream was different. Instead of the usual nightmares about skeletal figures or burning cities, Thomas found himself running through a forest on 4 legs, with senses so enhanced that he could smell individual animals from incredible distances. He could hear the heartbeats of mice hiding under fallen logs, see perfectly in complete darkness, and feel the subtle vibrations through his paws that told him about every creature moving within miles of his location. The most disturbing part wasn't the physical transformation, it was how natural it felt. Thomas wasn't struggling to control an animal body or fighting against alien instincts. He was simply, completely, authentically evolved. He had a pack, he had territory, he had prey relationships and dominance hierarchies that felt as familiar and comfortable as his daily prayers had the day before. In his dream, Thomas was the alpha of a pack that controlled a territory stretching from the forests around Compiègne to the hills near Soissons, an area he'd never actually visited, but which he could navigate in his dreams with the confidence of an animal that had been born there. He had a mate, a silver-gray she-wolf named something that translated roughly as Moonrunner, and 3 cubs from the previous spring who were just learning to hunt. But here's where Thomas's story gets really weird, and we know about it in such detail because medieval monasteries were obsessive about record keeping, especially when it came to anything that might be considered supernatural or demonic. Instead of having just one strange dream and moving on with his life, Thomas started having these Wolf dreams every single night for 3 months straight. And they weren't just random animal dreams, they were coherent, sequential experiences where he lived an entire alternate life as a Wolf. Each night, Thomas would go to sleep in his narrow monastery cell and wake up in the forest, continuing the Wolf life where he'd left off the night before. He could remember the exact location where his pack had made their den, the seasonal migration patterns of the deer they hunted, the complex social relationships between different pack members, and the ongoing territorial disputes with neighboring Wolf packs. The dreams had a level of consistency and detail that was unlike anything Thomas had ever experienced. He could remember the individual scent signatures of every animal in his territory, the subtle differences in hunting strategies required for different types of prey, and the complex communication system that wolves use to coordinate pack activities across vast distances. Most disturbing of all, Thomas could remember killing, not just animals, but occasionally humans who wandered too far into the forest. In his dreams, humans were just another type of prey, slower and weaker than deer, easier to catch but more dangerous because they sometimes traveled in groups and carried weapons. Thomas could remember the taste of human flesh, the satisfaction of a successful hunt, and the way human fear smelled different from the fear of other animals. When Thomas woke up each morning, he retained all these memories and instincts. The first sign that something was seriously wrong came during the morning prayers, when Thomas found himself unconsciously sniffing the air to identify which monks had been where, what they had eaten, whether they were healthy or sick, and what their emotional states were. Information that his normal human senses couldn't possibly have provided was suddenly available to him through enhanced smell and hearing. Brother Thomas tried everything to stop these dreams. He fasted for days at a time, thinking that hunger might be causing hallucinations. He spent entire nights in the chapel, praying continuously to avoid sleep. He even tried sleeping in different locations around the monastery, hoping that his cell might be cursed or contaminated in some way. Nothing worked. If anything, the dreams became more vivid and the daytime after effects became stronger. Thomas started having difficulty eating the monastery's regular food. Bread and vegetables felt wrong in his mouth, and his body craved raw meat in ways that horrified his conscious mind, but felt completely natural to some deeper part of him. The psychological changes were even more disturbing. Thomas, who had been known for his gentle, scholarly nature, became increasingly aggressive and territorial. He started unconsciously marking his territory around the monastery, and I mean literally marking it, in ways that medieval record keepers were too polite to describe explicitly, but that made his fellow monks extremely uncomfortable. Thomas began challenging other monks physically when they entered areas he had unconsciously claimed as his own. His cell, the section of the scriptorium where he worked, the particular garden plots he tended, these became zones that he defended with an intensity that was completely out of character. When Brother Francis tried to borrow a book from Thomas's desk, Thomas actually bared his teeth and made a low growling sound before catching himself and apologizing profusely. The crisis escalated when Thomas started demonstrating abilities that no human should have possessed. His night vision improved so dramatically that he could navigate the monastery corridors in complete darkness without any light source. His sense of smell became so acute that he could identify individual monks by their scent from across the courtyard, detect illness before symptoms appeared, and track people's movements throughout the day just by following their scent trails. Most unnaturally, Thomas developed an almost supernatural ability to predict when strangers were approaching the monastery. He would become agitated hours before visitors arrived, pacing restlessly and positioning himself near the gates as if he could sense people approaching from miles away. The other monks initially thought this was useful. Thomas became an informal early warning system for the community. But his behavior was so intense and animalistic that it made everyone deeply uncomfortable. The abbot Don Felipe was initially skeptical about Thomas's claims that he was experiencing Wolf dreams. Medieval monks had anxiety dreams all the time. The isolated, celibate lifestyle combined with constant contemplation of sin, death, and judgment wasn't exactly conducive to peaceful sleep. Don Felipe had dealt with monks who claimed to have prophetic dreams, dreams about demons, dreams about saints. One more monk with unusual sleep experiences didn't seem particularly noteworthy. But when Thomas started demonstrating physical capabilities that seemed impossible for a human, Don Felipe began paying closer attention. Thomas could track people by scent alone, following trails that were days old across complex terrain. He could detect approaching weather changes with accuracy that seemed to come from sensing atmospheric pressure differences that normal humans couldn't perceive. Most disturbing, he could identify potential threats or dangers with an instinct that seemed to come from somewhere beyond normal human awareness. Don Felipe was a practical man who had been managing monastic communities for over 20 years. He'd seen monks experience everything from mystical visions to complete psychological breakdowns, and he'd learned to distinguish between spiritual experiences that were genuinely meaningful and symptoms of mental illness that required medical intervention. Thomas's case was unlike anything Don Felipe had encountered. The physical changes were too dramatic and too consistent to be explained by anxiety or psychological stress. The enhanced senses, improved reflexes, and instinctive behavioral changes suggested that something was happening to Thomas that went beyond normal human psychological variation. Medieval medicine had limited understanding of what we would now call dissociative disorders or severe psychological trauma. But medieval religious traditions had extensive frameworks for understanding spiritual experiences that involved temporary changes in consciousness or identity. Don Felipe consulted church authorities, scholars from the University of Paris, and experts in both medicine and theology, trying to determine whether Thomas was experiencing a medical condition, a psychological disorder, or something supernatural. The consensus that eventually emerged was that Thomas was experiencing a form of spiritual warfare. His soul was being invaded or influenced by something that wasn't entirely human. This wasn't necessarily demonic possession in the traditional sense, but it was definitely a condition that required spiritual intervention rather than just medical treatment. The solution they implemented was both practical and theologically sophisticated. Instead of trying to suppress Thomas's Wolf experiences entirely, they worked to help him maintain his human consciousness and Christian identity while experiencing them. They taught him prayer techniques he could use within the dreams, ways to remember his vows and spiritual commitments even while experiencing animal instincts. This approach required Thomas to develop a kind of dual consciousness, being fully present in the Wolf dreams, while simultaneously maintaining awareness of his human identity and moral responsibilities. It was like learning to be bilingual, but instead of switching between languages, he was switching between completely different forms of consciousness and identity. The training process took months and was incredibly challenging both psychologically and spiritually. Thomas had to learn to experience predatory instincts without acting on them, to feel territorial aggression without expressing it violently, to maintain human ethical standards while inhabiting a consciousness that operated according to completely different moral frameworks. But gradually, Thomas learned to navigate both worlds. He could hunt with his Wolf pack in dreams without killing humans, even when his Wolf instincts identified them as easy prey. He could experience the wild freedom and enhanced senses of Wolf consciousness while maintaining the discipline and spiritual focus of monastic life. The really remarkable thing is that Thomas's enhanced abilities persisted and even improved as he learned to integrate his dual nature. His Volf-derived senses became incredibly useful to the monastery community. He could detect approaching dangers, track lost travelers, predict weather patterns, and even diagnose illnesses by changes in people's scent that indicated disease or infection. Thomas became something of a legend in the region, the monk who could track like a Volf but maintained the soul of a saint. Travelers who got lost in the extensive forests around the monastery would seek him out, knowing that he could find them and guide them to safety under conditions where normal human navigation would be impossible. Local nobles began consulting Thomas about hunting and forest management, recognizing that his understanding of animal behavior and forest ecology was far beyond what any normal human could achieve. Thomas could predict animal migration patterns, identify areas where game would be most abundant in different seasons, and even mediate conflicts between human communities and Volf packs that were causing problems for local farmers. But perhaps most importantly, Thomas used his experiences to develop new approaches to spiritual practice that helped other monks deal with their own psychological and spiritual challenges. He understood that human consciousness was far more flexible and expandable than most people realized, and that experiences that seemed dangerous or impossible might actually be opportunities for growth if they were approached with the right preparation and support. Thomas lived to be nearly 80 years old, which was remarkable longevity for the 14th century. Throughout his later years, he continued to have occasional Volf dreams, and he continued to demonstrate enhanced senses and instincts that served his community. But he also became known as one of the most spiritually mature and psychologically balanced monks in the region, someone who had learned to integrate aspects of consciousness that most humans never even recognize exist. His final recorded words were allegedly, "I go now to discover what dreams await beyond the veil, and whether the Volf will follow me there, or whether we will finally become one spirit." Don Felipe noted that Thomas died during a full moon, and that his last night on earth he howled once in his sleep, not in distress, but in what sounded like a call to something waiting for him in whatever realm consciousness travels to after death. Now everyone knows Leonardo da Vinci was obsessed with flight. His notebooks are filled with sketches of flying machines, studies of bird anatomy, and theories about aerodynamics that wouldn't be proven correct until centuries later. But what most people don't know is that Leonardo's fascination with flight might have started with a series of recurring dreams where he experienced life as various birds, dreams so realistic that they influenced not just his inventions, but his understanding of three-dimensional space itself. This story comes from Leonardo's private journals, pages that were written in his characteristic mirror, script and hidden among his technical drawings. These weren't meant for publication or scholarly discussion. They were personal records of experiences that Leonardo himself seemed to find both fascinating and deeply disturbing. Leonardo was 51 years old in 1503, at the absolute height of his artistic and intellectual powers. He was working simultaneously on the Mona Lisa, planning military fortifications for Cesare Borgia, designing hydraulic systems for Italian city-states, and conducting anatomical studies that wouldn't be surpassed for centuries. His mind was operating at a level of creative intensity that few humans have ever achieved, processing information and making connections that seemed almost supernatural to his contemporaries. But it was also during this period of incredible productivity that Leonardo began experiencing something that challenged everything he thought he knew about the boundaries of human consciousness and the nature of individual identity. Starting sometime around the spring of 1503, when Leonardo was living in Florence and working on some of his most famous paintings, he began having dreams where he experienced flight from the perspective of different birds. Not dreams about watching birds fly, and not dreams about himself flying like a bird, dreams where he literally was the bird, experiencing the world through avian senses, navigation systems, and instincts that had been refined through millions of years of evolution. The first dream that Leonardo recorded in detail involved him being a red kite, a medium-sized bird of prey that was common in the hills around Florence. In his dream, Leonardo found himself soaring over the Tuscan countryside, seeing the landscape from perspectives no human had ever experienced. But this wasn't just visual flight. He could feel air currents supporting his wings. understand the complex three-dimensional topology of invisible thermal columns, and navigate using magnetic and celestial cues that his human consciousness couldn't normally perceive. What made Leonardo's bird dreams particularly remarkable was the level of technical detail they contained. As a red kite in his dreams, Leonardo could sense minute changes in air pressure that indicated approaching weather systems, feel the way different wing positions affected lift and drag, and understand intuitively how to use wind currents to fly for hours without expending energy through wing flapping. But the dreams weren't limited to one species, and they weren't random or disconnected experiences. Over the course of several months, Leonardo systematically experienced life as different types of birds, each with its own distinct set of abilities, instincts, and ways of perceiving the world. As a peregrine falcon, Leonardo experienced the most extreme aerial hunting in the natural world. Peregrine falcons dive at speeds exceeding 200 miles per hour, using gravitational acceleration and precise aerodynamic control to strike prey with impact forces that would kill most animals instantly. In his dreams, Leonardo felt what it was like to process visual information at speeds that allowed split-second navigation adjustments during high-velocity dives, to calculate intercept courses, with moving prey while falling through three-dimensional space faster than any other living creature. The mathematical and engineering principles involved in peregrine falcon hunting were so complex that Leonardo filled dozens of notebook pages trying to work out the physics and geometry. His calculations of dive angles, velocity vectors, and impact dynamics were centuries ahead of their time, based entirely on his first-hand dream experience of being a hunting falcon. As a swallow, Leonardo experienced a completely different form of aerial mastery, the ability to perform continuous, precise maneuvers that required constant micro-adjustments to wing position and body orientation. Swallows spend most of their lives in the air, catching insects on the wing, navigating through complex three-dimensional obstacle courses, and performing aerial acrobatics that seem to defy the laws of physics. In his swallow dreams, Leonardo understood how to make dozens of navigation decisions per second, processing visual information about moving targets while simultaneously controlling flight path, speed, and orientation. The mental processing required for swallow flight was like playing three-dimensional chess at superhuman speed while performing gymnastics, except that making a mistake meant death. Leonardo's notebooks from this period show increasingly sophisticated understanding of what we now call aerodynamics, control theory, and biomechanics. His sketches of wing mechanisms became more accurate, his theories about lift and drag more precise, and his designs for flying machines more realistic. But the knowledge seemed to come from direct experience rather than theoretical analysis. As an eagle, Leonardo experienced soaring flight that could last for hours without a single wing beat. Eagles are masters of reading thermal columns, rising columns of heated air that provide lift for soaring birds. In his dreams, Leonardo could sense these invisible thermal highways, feel the subtle temperature and pressure differences that indicated where lift would be strongest, and navigate across vast distances using thermal energy alone. The Eagle dreams gave Leonardo insights into meteorology and atmospheric physics that were far ahead of Renaissance science. He developed theories about air pressure, temperature gradients, and wind patterns that wouldn't be formally understood until the development of modern meteorology. His understanding of how heated air rises and creates updrafts was so accurate that his notes are still referenced by glider pilots and atmospheric scientists. But perhaps the most profound dreams involved Leonardo experiencing life as tiny songbirds, creatures whose aerial abilities seem almost magical compared to larger birds. Small songbirds can change direction instantaneously, hover in place, fly backwards, and navigate through dense vegetation at high speeds without collisions. Their flight capabilities require processing visual and spatial information at rates that exceed most computer systems. In his songbird dreams, Leonardo experienced consciousness that operated at completely different temporal scales than human awareness. Decisions that would take humans minutes to make were processed in milliseconds. Navigation calculations that would require complex mathematical analysis were performed instinctively through direct sensory integration. What's really fascinating is how these dreams influenced Leonardo's artistic work. His later paintings show understanding of perspective, light, and three-dimensional space that seems almost superhuman. The way he painted landscapes from elevated viewpoints, his understanding of how atmospheric perspective affects color and clarity at different altitudes, his ability to capture the sense of motion and space in static images, all of this suggests he was drawing from experiences no earthbound human should have been able to have. The Mona Lisa, which Leonardo was working on during the period of his most intense bird dreams, shows compositional techniques and spatial relationships that seem to come from aerial perspective. The landscape background, with its winding paths and elevated viewpoints, suggests knowledge of how terrain looks from above. The subtle gradations of color and atmosphere in the background demonstrate understanding of how air and light behave at different altitudes. Leonardo also began making anatomical discoveries about bird flight that were centuries ahead of his time. His studies of wing mechanics, feather structure, and the relationship between body weight and wing surface area were so accurate that modern aeronautical engineers use them as reference materials. But how did a Renaissance artist, working without modern scientific instruments or mathematical tools, figure out principles of flight that wouldn't be formally understood until the Wright brothers and the development of powered flight? According to his private journals, the knowledge came directly from his bird dreams. He wasn't just observing flight from the outside, he was experiencing it from the inside, understanding through direct sensation how air moves over wing surfaces, how birds adjust individual feather positions to control lift and drag, how they use tail feathers as rudders and elevators, and how they integrate sensory information from multiple sources to maintain stable flight. But the bird dreams came with psychological costs that Leonardo documented in his private writings. He started developing what he called terrestrial claustrophobia, a condition where being confined to ground level felt unnatural and oppressive. Leonardo would spend hours each day on the highest towers and rooftops he could find, claiming that being close to the ground made him feel imprisoned in stone and earth like a creature meant for other realms. His assistants noted that Leonardo became increasingly restless and distracted when working indoors, frequently interrupting his painting and engineering work to climb to elevated locations where he could observe the sky. He developed a habit of staring at birds with an intensity that bordered on obsession, watching their movements with the focus of someone trying to remember something important that had been forgotten. Leonardo also noted changes in his visual perception that seemed related to his bird dreams. Colors became more vivid, especially blues and ultraviolets that most humans couldn't normally see clearly. His ability to detect motion improved dramatically. He could spot birds flying at distances that other people couldn't even see, and he could track multiple moving objects simultaneously without losing focus on any of them. Most strangely, Leonardo developed an almost supernatural ability to predict weather patterns. He could sense approaching storms days before they arrived, detect changes in wind direction hours before they became noticeable to others, and predict the formation of thermal columns that would be suitable for soaring flight. This meteorological sensitivity became so reliable that other artists and engineers began consulting Leonardo about weather conditions before starting outdoor projects. The dreams reached their peak intensity during the period when Leonardo was working on his most ambitious flying machine designs. He would dream of soaring above the Alps, analyzing how birds handled high-altitude flight conditions, extreme weather, and navigation across vast distances without landmarks. These dreams provided him with technical insights that he incorporated into increasingly sophisticated aircraft designs. Leonardo's flying machine sketches from 1503-1504 show mechanical understanding that wouldn't be achieved again until the early 20th century. His designs included concepts for adjustable wing camber, variable pitch propellers, and control surfaces that anticipated modern aircraft engineering by centuries. But the designs weren't based on trial and error experimentation or theoretical speculation. They were based on Leonardo's direct experience of how flight actually worked from the inside. But there was a darker psychological dimension to Leonardo's aerial experiences. He began having dreams where he was a predatory bird, a hawk or eagle hunting and killing, prey with efficiency and satisfaction that disturbed his waking consciousness. In his journals, Leonardo describes the conflicted pleasure he felt in these hunting dreams. The way predatory instincts felt both alien and natural, the satisfaction of using superior vision, speed, and tactical intelligence to catch smaller animals. These predatory dreams began influencing Leonardo's waking behavior in subtle but noticeable ways. His assistants reported that he became more observational and analytical in his interactions with people, studying human movement and behavior with the calculating assessment of a predator evaluating potential prey. Not with harmful intentions, but with the same systematic analysis of strength, speed, vulnerability, and behavioral patterns that a hunting bird would use. Leonardo developed new techniques for observing and recording human anatomy based on his predatory bird perspective. His studies of muscle structure, joint mechanics, and movement dynamics became more precise and comprehensive, as if he was analyzing human bodies the way a hawk would study the anatomy of its prey species. The bird dreams also influenced Leonardo's understanding of mathematics and engineering in ways that went far beyond flight mechanics. Birds navigate using complex calculations involving wind vectors, energy conservation, optimal path finding, and three-dimensional geometry. In his dreams, Leonardo experienced these calculations not as abstract mathematical problems, but as intuitive, embodied knowledge that was inseparable from the physical experience of flight. This mathematical intuition began appearing in Leonardo's engineering projects that had nothing to do with flight. His designs for hydraulic systems, mechanical devices, and architectural structures showed understanding of force vectors, structural dynamics, and optimization principles that seemed to come from somewhere beyond normal human analytical thinking. Perhaps most remarkably, Leonardo's flight dreams seem to have given him insights into physics and engineering that weren't formally discovered until centuries later. His understanding of lift, drag, thrust, and weight, the four fundamental forces of flight, was essentially correct, even though the mathematical principles wouldn't be established until the development of modern aerodynamics. His theories about airflow, pressure differentials, and fluid dynamics anticipated discoveries that wouldn't be made until the 18th and 19th centuries. The dreams eventually faded as Leonardo aged, but they left him permanently changed both as an artist and as a person. In his final years, he would often be found standing in high places, staring at the sky with an expression that his assistants described as profound longing mixed with ancient sadness. He reportedly said that his greatest regret wasn't any particular painting or invention he hadn't finished, but that he had never been able to truly fly while awake. Leonardo continued working on flying machine designs until his death, becoming increasingly convinced that human flight was not just possible, but inevitable. His final flying machine sketches show designs that were remarkably close to successful aircraft configurations, based on decades of insights gained through his bird consciousness dreams. Leonardo died in 1519 at the Chateau du Clos-Luce in France, where he had spent his final years working on hydraulic engineering projects for the French court. According to his assistant Francesco Melzi, Leonardo's last coherent words were, "I have seen the world from heights that no man has reached, and now I must learn what lies beyond the sky itself. The birds know secrets that earthbound creatures cannot imagine." That night, witnesses reported seeing unusual numbers of birds circling the chateau until dawn, raptors, songbirds, and waterfowl flying together in formations that seemed almost ceremonial. Some observers claimed the birds were performing aerial maneuvers that resembled the flight patterns Leonardo had sketched in his notebooks, as if they were demonstrating the principles he had spent his life trying to understand and recreate. In the Drakensberg Mountains of what is now South Africa, there lived a Zulu healer named Namsa who, in 1847, began experiencing dreams that would revolutionize not just her own understanding of medicine, but her entire tribe's approach to healing and their relationship with the natural world. And when I say revolutionize, I mean she basically became the equivalent of a 19th century African medical school, except her professors were elephants and her classroom was the dreamscape of collective animal consciousness. Namsa wasn't just any healer. She was considered one of the most skilled traditional doctors in the region, someone who could diagnose illnesses that other healers couldn't even identify and prepare medicines that seemed to work like what we might call magic if we didn't understand the sophisticated botanical knowledge behind them. But even by the standards of traditional African medicine, which has always recognized the spiritual and energetic dimensions of healing, what happened to Namsa was extraordinary. To understand the context of Namsa's story, you need to picture the southern African landscape in 1847. This was a time when European colonization was rapidly changing the region, but vast areas were still dominated by traditional African societies that had developed incredibly sophisticated relationships with their natural environment over thousands of years. The Zulu people, in particular, had created a complex civilization that integrated political organization, military strategy, agricultural innovation, and medical knowledge in ways that allowed them to thrive in challenging environmental conditions. Namsa lived in a village nestled in the foothills of the Drakensberg Range, in an area where the grasslands of the interior plateau met the more forested regions closer to the coast. This was prime elephant territory. Vast herds of African elephants moved through the region seasonally, following ancient migration routes that connected different ecological zones and allowed them to access various food sources throughout the year. The relationship between Namsa's people and the elephant herds was complex and multifaceted. Elephants were respected as powerful spiritual beings, sources of valuable materials like ivory and hide, and also dangerous neighbors who could destroy crops and threaten human settlements if they weren't treated with appropriate caution and respect. Traditional Zulu culture included elaborate protocols for interacting with elephants, ceremonies for asking permission to hunt them when necessary, and spiritual practices that recognized elephants as carriers of ancestral wisdom. Namsa had grown up hearing stories about elephants from her grandmother, who was also a healer and who taught her that elephants possessed ancient knowledge about medicine, navigation, and survival that had been accumulated over countless generations. According to traditional teachings, elephants could remember locations of water and food sources across vast territories, passed medical knowledge down through matriarchal lineages, and maintained complex social relationships that demonstrated forms of intelligence that were different from, but not inferior to, human consciousness. But Namsa's personal relationship with elephants began in 1847 during a severe drought that had lasted for nearly 2 years. The tribal lands were dying, animals were migrating away or dying of thirst, and Namsa's people were facing starvation. Traditional healing methods weren't working because the medicinal plants they depended on had withered away, and the spiritual balance of the region seemed fundamentally disrupted. This wasn't just an ordinary dry season, this was a drought, so severe that even the oldest elders couldn't remember anything comparable. Rivers that had flowed continuously for generations had dried up completely. Springs that had been reliable water sources for centuries had stopped flowing. The carefully managed agricultural systems that sustained the community were failing, and the wild game that provided protein were either dying or migrating to areas with better water access. Namsa had been working desperately to help her community survive, but her traditional healing methods were becoming less effective as the plants she needed became unavailable. Many of the medicinal herbs that formed the basis of traditional Zulu medicine required specific growing conditions, adequate rainfall, particular soil types, specific relationships with other plants that the drought had disrupted. Even when she could find the plants she needed, they were often withered or stressed in ways that reduced their therapeutic potency. It was during this crisis that Namsa began having dreams where she was an ancient matriarch elephant, leading her herd across vast distances in search of water and food. But these weren't symbolic or metaphorical dreams about being strong like an elephant or wise like an elephant. They were detailed, sensory experiences where she felt the world through an elephant's nervous system, processed information through an elephant's brain, and accessed memories that seemed to span generations of elephant knowledge. The first elephant dream that Namsa could remember clearly involved her standing at the edge of what appeared to be endless grassland, feeling thirsty in a way that was more intense than anything she had experienced as a human. But it wasn't just personal thirst. She could sense the thirst and hunger of dozens of other elephants. who were depending on her leadership to find resources that would keep the entire herd alive. In her dream, Namsa could sense water sources from incredible distances, feeling underground rivers through vibrations in the earth that traveled up through her elephant feet and legs. Elephants have incredibly sensitive feet that can detect seismic vibrations from miles away. And in her dreams, Namsa experienced the world as a complex map of underground water, seasonal flooding patterns, and geological features that indicated where digging might reveal hidden springs. She could remember the locations of seasonal water holes that hadn't been used for decades, navigation knowledge that seemed to be passed down through generations of elephant. Matriarchs like a living library of geographical and ecological information. In her dreams, Namsa had access to memories that weren't her own knowledge about rainfall patterns, seasonal variations, and long-term environmental cycles that spanned far longer than any individual elephant's lifetime. But the most remarkable aspect of Namsa's elephant dreams was how they provided her with sophisticated understanding of plant medicine that went far beyond anything in traditional human healing systems. Elephants are known to practice what scientists call pharmacognosy, self-medication using plants. But what Namsa experienced in her dreams was far more complex than simple self-medication. In her elephant consciousness, Namsa could detect the medicinal properties of plants through senses that were far more acute than human smell and taste. Elephants have incredibly sophisticated chemical detection abilities. They can analyze the molecular composition of plants and determine their therapeutic potential, toxicity levels, and optimal preparation methods through direct sensory evaluation. More importantly, Namsa's elephant dreams gave her access to what seemed to be generational knowledge about which plants could treat which conditions, how to prepare them for maximum effectiveness, and how to combine different botanical medicines in ways that enhanced their individual therapeutic properties. This wasn't just instinctive self-medication, it was systematic pharmaceutical knowledge that had been developed and refined over millions of years of elephant evolution. When Namsa woke from these dreams, she retained not just the memories but the enhanced sensory abilities. She could detect medicinal compounds in plants by smell alone, identify healing herbs even when they were dormant or disguised by drought conditions, and sense the health status of people and animals through subtle chemical signals that her normal human senses shouldn't have been able to detect. Following the guidance from her elephant dreams, Namsa led her people to water sources that had been hidden or forgotten, some of them underground springs that required digging in places where no surface water was visible. She would guide groups of villagers to locations that looked completely barren, instruct them to dig in specific spots, and consistently find water at depths that seemed to be based on knowledge she couldn't explain, but that proved accurate time after time. Every location she identified based on her dream memories turned out to have water, sometimes just enough for immediate needs, sometimes substantial underground springs that could support the community for extended periods. The accuracy of her water-finding abilities was so remarkable that neighboring communities began seeking her guidance when their own water sources failed. But the real breakthrough came when Namsa began applying the plant medicine knowledge from her elephant dreams to human healing. She started preparing remedies using combinations of plants that no human healer had ever used together, methods of extraction and preparation that seemed to come from some vast, non-human intelligence that had been experimenting with botanical medicine for millennia. The first major success came when Namsa successfully treated an outbreak of what was probably dysentery that was affecting many people in her community. Traditional treatments weren't working, and several people had already died from dehydration and complications. Using guidance from her elephant dreams, Namsa prepared a medicine that combined plants in ways that seemed counterintuitive but that proved remarkably effective. The preparation involved plants that grew in different ecological zones, some from riverine areas, others from high grasslands, still others from forest margins. No human healer had ever thought to combine these particular species because they didn't grow near each other and weren't traditionally associated with treating the same conditions. But in her elephant dreams, Namsa had learned that elephants would travel vast distances to find specific plant combinations that addressed complex health issues. These new medicines worked with effectiveness that amazed other healers. Namsa could cure diseases that had baffled the most experienced traditional doctors, treat conditions that were usually considered fatal, and prepare preventive medicines that seemed to strengthen people's resistance to illness in ways that traditional human medicine couldn't achieve. Word of Namsa's new healing abilities spread across the region like wildfire, and people began traveling hundreds of miles to consult with the healer who had learned medicine from elephants. But Namsa was careful to explain that she wasn't performing magic or accessing supernatural powers. She was applying knowledge that elephants had developed over millions of years of evolution, medical wisdom that was encoded in their behavioral patterns and passed down through their matriarchal culture. European missionaries and colonial doctors who encountered Namsa's work were initially skeptical, but they couldn't argue with her results. She was curing diseases that Western medicine couldn't treat effectively, using plant-based preparations that seemed to work through biological mechanisms that weren't understood by 19th century medical science. Dr. James Henderson, a Scottish missionary doctor who spent several months observing Namsa's practice in 1849, wrote detailed notes about her diagnostic methods and treatment protocols. Dr. Henderson had been trained at the University of Edinburgh, one of the leading medical schools in Europe, and he approached Namsa's work with the skepticism of someone who believed that European medicine represented the pinnacle of human knowledge about healing. But Henderson was honest enough to acknowledge when his preconceptions were challenged by evidence. He documented case after case where Namsa successfully treated conditions that his European medical training couldn't address effectively. Patients who had been given up for dead by European doctors recovered completely under Namsa's care. Diseases that typically had high mortality rates were cured using plant preparations that seemed to work through mechanisms that European medicine didn't understand. Henderson was particularly fascinated by Namsa's ability to detect illness before symptoms appeared, and her use of plant combinations that seemed to address not just immediate health problems but underlying systemic imbalances that predisposed people to various diseases. According to Henderson's notes, Namsa claimed to understand illness the way elephants do, not as isolated problems affecting individual organs, but as disruptions in the overall flow of life energy through the body. Her treatments focused on restoring balance and strengthening the body's natural healing abilities, rather than just attacking specific symptoms or disease organisms. This was a radically different approach from European medicine, which tended to focus on identifying and treating specific pathological conditions rather than supporting overall health and immune function. What's remarkable is that many of Namsa's insights about elephant behavior and plant medicine have been confirmed by modern scientific research. Elephants do indeed engage in sophisticated self-medication, seeking out specific plants when they're ill and using medicinal substances in ways that demonstrate complex understanding of pharmaceutical principles. They do pass medical knowledge down through matriarchal lineages, with older females teaching younger ones about which plants to use under which circumstances. Modern ethnobotanists have studied many of the plant combinations that Namsa pioneered, and they've found that these preparations often contain compounds that work synergistically in ways that enhance their individual medicinal properties. Her methods of preparation frequently involve fermentation processes, careful timing of harvest based on lunar cycles, and extraction techniques that increase the bioavailability of active compounds. Sophisticated pharmaceutical methods that weren't formally understood by Western science until the 20th century. But Namsa's elephant dreams went far beyond just medical knowledge. They also gave her insights into elephant social behavior, communication methods, and ecological relationships that wouldn't be documented by wildlife researchers until decades later. She understood that elephants use infrasonic communication, sound frequencies below human hearing, to coordinate herd movements across vast distances. She knew that they have complex funeral rituals for their dead, grieving processes that can last for days, and methods of caring for sick and injured herd members that demonstrate sophisticated understanding of medical care. Namsa used this ecological and behavioral knowledge to help her people develop more sustainable relationships with their natural environment. She could predict seasonal patterns based on elephant migration behaviors, locate resources during difficult periods by understanding how elephants found food and water during droughts, and understand the complex web of relationships between different species that maintain the health of their ecosystem. The psychological impact of the elephant dreams on Namsa was profound and lasting. She developed what she described as ancient wisdom, a sense of connection to deep time and collective memory that extended far beyond her individual human experience. She felt like she was carrying the accumulated knowledge of countless generations of elephant matriarchs, wisdom about survival, healing, and the interconnectedness of all life that had been refined over millions of years. This expanded consciousness came with both benefits and challenges. Namsa's enhanced abilities made her an incredibly effective healer and community leader, but they also made it difficult for her to relate to people who hadn't experienced the kind of consciousness expansion she had undergone. She often felt isolated by the depth and complexity of her knowledge, particularly her understanding of ecological relationships and natural systems that most humans couldn't perceive or appreciate. Namsa lived to be over 90 years old, which was extraordinary longevity for her time and place. Throughout her later years, she continued to have occasional elephant dreams, and she trained other healers in the methods she had learned from these experiences. She established a tradition of dream-based learning that continued among her people for several generations, with selected healers being taught to cultivate animal consciousness dreams as a source of medical and ecological knowledge. Her final recorded words, translated from Zulu, were, "The great mothers are calling me home. I go now to run with the herds in the dreamland where all knowledge flows together like rivers joining the sea. The ancestors wait beyond the baobab trees, and the elephants will show me paths through country where time moves like seasons and wisdom grows like grass after rain." In the winter of 1743, in a small Inuit village near what is now Barrow, Alaska, a shaman named Yuki experienced something that would become legendary among his people and provide survival strategies that would be passed down through generations. And when I say legendary, I mean this story became so important to Arctic survival that it was still being told by Inuit elders in the 20th century, long after the traditional way of life had been disrupted by European contact. Yuki was already known as a powerful Ngakuit, a traditional Inuit spiritual leader and healer who served as the intermediary between the human world and the spirit world. But what happened to him during the brutal winter of 1743 was unprecedented even, by the standards of a culture that took spiritual transformation very seriously, and that had developed sophisticated understandings of how human consciousness could access knowledge and abilities from other forms of life. To understand the significance of Yuki's story, you need to appreciate just how harsh Arctic conditions were in the 18th century, and how precisely adapted Inuit culture had become to survive in what is arguably the most challenging environment on Earth. The Inuit had spent thousands of years developing hunting techniques, tool technologies, clothing systems, and social organizations that allowed them to not just survive, but actually thrive in temperatures that could kill unprepared humans within hours. Yuki lived in a village of about 40 people, located on the coast of the Arctic Ocean where the frozen sea met the tundra. This was prime hunting territory for seals, walruses, whales, and polar bears, the marine mammals that form the basis of Inuit survival. But it was also an environment where a single mistake in reading ice conditions, weather patterns, or animal behavior could mean death for individuals or disaster for entire communities. The winter of 1743 was one of the worst on record in the Arctic. Temperatures dropped so low that even experienced Inuit hunters couldn't venture out safely for extended periods. The sea ice was thicker and more unstable than usual, making traditional hunting methods extremely dangerous. Storms lasted for days at a time, creating whiteout conditions that made navigation impossible. Even worse, the extreme cold seemed to have driven away or killed many of the marine animals that the community depended on for food. Traditional food stores were running dangerously low, and there was no way to hunt seals, whales, or other marine animals using the methods that had sustained Yuki's people for generations. The hunters were facing conditions that exceeded their considerable expertise, and the community was slowly starving despite having some of the most sophisticated Arctic survival knowledge in the world. It was during this crisis that Yuki began having dreams where he was a massive polar bear, roaming across the ice in search of food and survival opportunities that no human hunter could have found. But these weren't just survival dreams or symbolic visions about being strong like a polar bear. They were detailed educational experiences where he learned hunting techniques, ice navigation skills, and environmental awareness that seemed to come from thousands of years of polar bear evolution. The first dream that Yuki could remember in detail began with him standing on sea ice that stretched to the horizon in every direction, feeling hungry in a way that was more intense and focused than human hunger. But it wasn't just personal hunger. He could sense that finding food was a matter of life and death, not just for himself, but for cubs that were depending on his hunting success to survive the winter. In his dream, Yuki could sense seals breathing through ice holes from incredible distances, detecting the subtle vibrations and scent traces that indicated where seals were, maintaining their access to air and water beneath the frozen surface. Polar bears have some of the most acute senses in the animal kingdom. They can smell seals from over a mile away, detect breathing holes under several feet of snow, and sense prey movement through ice that's thick enough to support their 1,000-pound body weight. But what Yuki experienced in his dreams went beyond just enhanced senses. He gained access to what seemed to be instinctive knowledge about Arctic survival that had been refined through millions of years of polar bear evolution. He could read ice conditions with supernatural accuracy, knowing which areas were safe to traverse and which would collapse under weight, which ice formations indicated the presence of breathing holes or seal dens, and how to move across unstable surfaces without breaking through into the freezing water below. The hunting strategies that Yuki learned in his polar bear dreams were unlike anything in traditional Inuit techniques. Polar bears hunt seals primarily by waiting motionlessly at breathing holes for hours at a time, using patience, stealth, and precise timing that requires extraordinary physical and mental discipline. In his dreams, Yuki learned how to enter a state of focused alertness that could be maintained for extended periods without mental fatigue, how to control his body temperature and energy expenditure to prevent freezing while remaining completely still, and how to make lightning-fast strikes with perfect accuracy when seals finally appeared. When Yuki woke from these dreams, he retained not just the memories but the physical abilities. His tolerance for cold increased dramatically. He could work outside in temperatures that incapacitated other hunters, remaining active and alert in conditions that should have caused hypothermia and death. His sense of smell became so acute that he could track prey across miles of snow and ice, following scent trails that were invisible to normal human senses but that led consistently to seal populations that other hunters couldn't locate. Most remarkably, Yuki developed an intuitive understanding of ice conditions that seemed to come from somewhere beyond human experience. He could predict ice breakups days before they occurred, identify safe travel routes across surfaces that appeared identical to other experienced hunters, and locate areas where traditional hunting methods could still be effective despite the extreme weather conditions. Using the knowledge from his polar bear dreams, Yuki led hunting expeditions that successfully found food sources when traditional methods had completely failed. He guided hunters to seal populations that had been inaccessible using conventional Inuit techniques, led them across ice formations that other experienced guides had deemed impossible to navigate, and developed new hunting methods that were so effective they became permanent additions to his community's survival strategies. The most dramatic example of Yuki's polar bear wisdom came when he predicted a massive ice shelf collapse that would have killed dozens of people if they had remained in their traditional hunting areas. Based on subtle vibrations and environmental cues that he could sense but not fully explain in human terms, Yuki ordered the entire community to move their camp to higher ground and avoid certain areas of sea ice that appeared safe to other experienced hunters. 3 days later, massive ice formations collapsed exactly where their village had been located, creating open water and unstable ice conditions that would have been fatal to anyone caught in the affected area. The ice breakup was so sudden and extensive that it changed the local geography permanently, creating new channels and eliminating hunting areas that had been used for generations. Yuki's enhanced abilities weren't limited to hunting and ice navigation. The polar bear dreams also gave him insights into Arctic weather patterns that allowed him to predict storms, temperature changes, and seasonal variations with remarkable accuracy that exceeded even traditional Inuit weather prediction methods. He could sense approaching weather systems days before they arrived, giving his community time to prepare for extreme conditions by securing shelters, gathering fuel, and positioning themselves in locations that would provide maximum protection from wind and cold. Dr. Samuel Krantz, a Moravian missionary who spent time with Yuki's community in 1747, wrote detailed accounts of the shaman's abilities and the survival strategies he had developed. Krantz was initially skeptical of Yuki's claims about learning from polar bear. Dreams, European religious traditions generally viewed claims about animal consciousness as either superstition or demonic influence. But Krantz was an honest observer who documented what he witnessed rather than what he expected to see. According to Krantz's records, Yuki could identify safe ice conditions in situations where even the most experienced Inuit hunters were uncertain about the risks. He could locate prey animals under conditions that should have made hunting impossible, including during storms and in areas where other hunters had found no signs of wildlife. Most impressively, he could navigate across vast distances of apparently identical snow and ice, always finding his way to specific destinations without any visible landmarks or traditional navigation aids. Krantz noted that Yuki's hunting success rate was far higher than other hunters in the community, even those with decades more experience. During the harshest periods of winter, when other hunters returned empty-handed after days of effort, Yuki would consistently bring back seals, sometimes multiple animals in a single hunting trip. His techniques involved methods that other hunters initially found difficult to understand or replicate, but that proved remarkably effective when properly applied. The polar bear dreams continued throughout the remainder of the harsh winter, providing Yuki with seasonal knowledge about how polar bears adapt their behavior to changing ice conditions, food availability, and weather patterns. This knowledge allowed him to develop hunting and survival strategies that took advantage of seasonal opportunities that his community had never been able to exploit before. Polar bears are highly intelligent animals that modify their hunting strategies based on environmental conditions, prey availability, and seasonal changes in ice formation. In his dreams, Yuki learned to think like a polar bear, to analyze environmental conditions systematically, to adapt hunting techniques to specific circumstances, and to make strategic decisions about when to expend energy actively hunting versus when to conserve resources by waiting for better opportunities. By spring, when the extreme weather finally broke and normal hunting conditions returned, Yuki's community had not only survived the worst winter in living memory, but had actually improved their food security and developed new survival techniques that made them more resilient to future harsh winters. Their food stores were better stocked than usual. They had gained survival knowledge that would serve them for generations, and they had developed hunting methods that were more effective than their traditional techniques. But the polar bear dreams came with psychological costs that Yuki documented in the oral traditions he passed down to his successors. He described feeling increasingly isolated from other humans, relating more naturally to the solitary, patient hunting mindset of a polar bear than to the social dynamics of human community life. Polar bears are largely solitary animals except during mating season and when mothers are raising cubs. They spend most of their lives alone on the sea ice, traveling vast distances in search of food and maintaining territories that can span hundreds of square miles. In his dreams, Yuki had experienced this solitary existence as natural and comfortable, but it made returning to human social life feel constraining and artificial. Yuki developed what he called ice hunger, a compulsion to spend most of his time alone on the sea ice, claiming that being indoors or around groups of people felt confining and unnatural. He would disappear for weeks at a time, returning with game and valuable information about ice conditions and weather patterns, but becoming increasingly reluctant to participate in normal community activities like storytelling, ceremonies, or social gatherings. The shamanic traditions of Yuki's people recognized that powerful spiritual transformations often came with psychological costs. The ability to access non-human forms of consciousness could make it difficult to maintain fully human identity and social connections. Yuki worked with other elders and spiritual leaders to develop techniques for staying grounded in human community while still accessing the polar bear wisdom that had saved his people. These techniques involved regular participation in community ceremonies, maintaining human social bonds through storytelling and teaching, and finding ways to translate his polar bear knowledge into forms that could be shared with and used by other community members. Yuki learned to function as a bridge between human and polar bear consciousness, accessing the wisdom of both forms of awareness without being completely absorbed by either one. Yuki lived to an advanced age, continuing to serve as a guide and hunter well into his 70s. His reputation as someone who could find food and navigate safely under the most extreme conditions spread throughout the Arctic region, and other Inuit communities would seek his guidance during particularly difficult winters or when facing environmental challenges that exceeded their traditional knowledge. His final words, recorded in the oral tradition of his community, were, "The great white bear calls me to hunt in lands where winter never ends and the ice sings songs that only the ancestors can understand. I go now to join the eternal hunt across frozen seas where the spirit and the flesh become one, and where the patience of the bear meets the wisdom of the human in perfect balance." After Yuki's death, his community continued to use the survival techniques he had learned from his polar bear dreams. Many of these methods were so effective that they spread to other Inuit communities across the Arctic and became part of the traditional knowledge that allowed Arctic peoples to thrive in one of the most challenging environments on Earth. Modern Arctic researchers have studied many of Yuki's techniques and found them to be scientifically sound. His methods for reading ice conditions, predicting weather patterns, and locating prey animals demonstrate sophisticated understanding of Arctic ecology that matches modern scientific knowledge about polar bear behavior and Arctic environmental systems. Professor Edmund Hartley was already a respected marine biologist at Cambridge University when he began experiencing the dreams. That would challenge everything he thought he knew about deep ocean life, navigation, and the very nature of consciousness itself. This was 1876. When human knowledge of the deep sea was extremely limited, no one had ever descended more than a few hundred feet below the ocean surface, and most of what scientists knew about deep ocean life came from specimens that occasionally washed ashore or were brought up in fishing nets from relatively shallow waters. The deep ocean was essentially as unknown and inaccessible as outer space would be to later generations. Victorian marine biology was limited to studying coastal environments, tidal pools, and the relatively shallow waters around the British Isles. The idea that vast, complex ecosystems existed in the abyssal depths was purely theoretical, and most scientists assumed that the deep ocean was essentially a biological desert, too cold, too dark, and under too much pressure to support significant life. Hartley's specialty was coastal marine biology, studying the creatures that lived in tidal pools and shallow waters around Britain's extensive coastline. He was a methodical, empirical scientist who prided himself on basing his conclusions on direct observation and careful experimentation. The Victorian scientific establishment valued this approach highly. The idea that dreams or intuition could provide scientific insights would have been completely contrary to the rational, evidence-based methodology that had made British science the envy of the world. Hartley had spent 15 years building his reputation through careful fieldwork, detailed anatomical studies, and systematic classification of marine organisms. His papers on coastal ecology were widely cited. His techniques for preserving and studying marine specimens were adopted by researchers throughout Europe, and he was considered one of the leading authorities on British marine life. At age 42, he was at the peak of his career, respected by his colleagues and secure in his scientific worldview. But in the summer of 1876, during what should have been a routine research expedition to study coastal marine life in Cornwall, Hartley began having dreams that would shatter his confidence in the limitations of human knowledge and the boundaries of scientific methodology. The dreams began during a week-long field expedition to collect specimens from tidal pools and shallow, underwater environments around Land's End. Hartley was staying in a small fishing village, spending his days wading through tide pools and his evenings cataloging specimens and writing research notes. It was work he had done hundreds of times before, and he expected nothing more unusual than perhaps discovering a new species of sea anemone or documenting seasonal variations in local marine populations. The first dream occurred after a particularly exhausting day of fieldwork. Hartley had spent hours in cold water, collecting samples and making detailed observations of marine organisms in their natural habitats. He fell asleep easily, expecting to sleep soundly after the physical exertion of a long day outdoors. Instead, he found himself experiencing something that defied every assumption he had about the nature of consciousness, perception, and the limits of human experience. In his dream, Hartley was a sperm whale, diving to depths that no human had ever experienced, and encountering forms of marine life that weren't supposed to exist according to current scientific understanding. But this wasn't a fantasy about swimming with whales or some kind of mystical oceanic experience. It was a detailed, sensory experience of living as a deep-diving marine mammal with abilities that far exceeded anything in human experience. Hartley could hold his breath for over an hour while diving to depths exceeding 3,000 feet, navigating through complete darkness using echolocation systems that created three-dimensional maps of underwater terrain with precision that surpassed any human navigation technology. In his dream, Hartley's whale consciousness could produce focused sound beams that bounced off objects in the deep ocean and returned with information about size, distance, density, internal structure, and even the emotional states of other marine animals. Echolocation wasn't just a navigation tool, it was a form of perception that revealed aspects of the underwater world that vision could never access. Most remarkably, Hartley encountered deep-sea creatures in his dreams that science wouldn't discover for decades. He found himself hunting colossal squid with tentacles longer than any known cephalopod species, observing bioluminescent organisms that created complex light displays in the abyssal darkness, and witnessing underwater geological features like thermal vents and underwater mountain ranges that weren't supposed to exist according to 19th century oceanography. The colossal squid that Hartley encountered in his whale dreams were unlike anything described in scientific literature. These were intelligent predators with sophisticated hunting strategies, complex communication systems, and problem-solving abilities that seemed to demonstrate forms of consciousness that were alien but undeniably real. In his dreams, Hartley engaged in what could only be described as underwater battles that combined physical strength, tactical intelligence, and forms of underwater combat that required split-second decision-making under extreme pressure. What made these dream experiences particularly remarkable was their internal consistency and technical accuracy. Hartley's whale consciousness understood the physics of deep ocean diving in ways that anticipated scientific discoveries that wouldn't be made until the development of deep-sea submersibles in the 20th century. He experienced the effects of extreme pressure on body tissues, understood how marine mammals manage oxygen consumption during extended dives, and navigated using acoustic principles that wouldn't be formally described by science for decades. When Hartley woke from these dreams, he found that he retained not just memories, but enhanced sensory abilities that seemed impossible according to his understanding of human physiology. His hearing became more acute, especially for low-frequency sounds that most humans couldn't detect. He could identify the emotional states of marine animals through subtle acoustic cues that he shouldn't have been able to perceive or interpret. Most remarkably, Hartley developed an intuitive understanding of ocean currents, water temperature variations, and marine weather patterns that exceeded anything he had learned through formal scientific training. He could predict storms approaching from hundreds of miles away, identify underwater currents by subtle changes in surface conditions, and locate marine life concentrations using environmental cues that he couldn't fully explain but that proved consistently accurate. What makes Hartley's case particularly remarkable is that he began incorporating his dream experiences into his scientific work, making predictions about deep ocean life that were considered impossible by his contemporaries but were later proven accurate by 20th century marine research. He published papers describing creatures and environmental conditions that he claimed to have theorized through evolutionary modeling based on deep-sea adaptation principles, but which were actually based on his sperm whale dreams. Hartley's first major breakthrough came when he accurately predicted the existence of giant squid species that were far larger than any known cephalopods. He described their hunting behavior, anatomical features, and deep ocean habitat with remarkable accuracy, decades before specimens of colossal squid would be discovered by modern marine biology. His descriptions included details about their bioluminescent communication systems, their ability to change color and texture for camouflage, and their sophisticated tentacle coordination that wouldn't be documented until underwater filming technology became available. But perhaps most impressively, Hartley used insights from his whale dreams to predict the existence of hydrothermal vents on the ocean, flora, underwater geological features that create unique ecosystems based on geosynthesis rather than photosynthesis. This was a radical concept in 1876, when scientists assumed that all life on Earth ultimately depended on energy from the sun through photosynthetic processes. Hartley's theory was that deep ocean environments might support life through chemical processes that didn't require sunlight, using energy from geological activity to sustain complex ecosystems that were completely independent of surface-based food chains. This idea challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of life on Earth and suggested that biology was far more adaptable and diverse than Victorian science had imagined. His colleagues at Cambridge were initially skeptical of these theoretical predictions, especially since they seemed to be based more on intuition than on empirical evidence. But Hartley's reputation as a careful scientist gave weight to his ideas, and some of his predictions about shallow water marine life proved accurate enough to suggest that his methods, whatever they were, had some validity. The whale dreams also gave Hartley insights into marine mammal behavior that weren't formally documented until the development of underwater observation technology in the 20th century. He described complex social behaviors among sperm whales, including sophisticated hunting strategies that involved coordinated group tactics, communication methods using sound frequencies beyond human hearing, and cultural knowledge that was passed down through whale pods across generations. Hartley began developing revolutionary theories about marine mammal intelligence based on his dream experiences, suggesting that whales and dolphins possessed forms of consciousness that were different from, but not, inferior to human intelligence. This was a radical idea in Victorian England, where most scientists viewed animals as essentially biological machines without genuine consciousness, emotions, or intelligence. According to Hartley's theories, marine mammals had developed forms of intelligence that were adapted to three-dimensional underwater environments, acoustic communication systems, and social organizations that were far more complex than terrestrial animal societies. He suggested that whale consciousness might be fundamentally different from human awareness, but equally sophisticated in its own environmental context. The psychological impact of the whale dreams on Hartley was profound and lasting. He developed an intense longing for the ocean that made it difficult for him to work inland or spend extended periods away from coastal waters. Colleagues noted that he became restless and distracted when confined to laboratories or lecture halls, frequently interrupting his work to visit the nearest coastline where he could observe the sea. Hartley also began experiencing what he called depth sickness when he was at the surface, a feeling that shallow water and surface conditions were somehow artificial and limiting compared to the vast, three-dimensional freedom of the deep ocean. He described feeling claustrophobic in surface environments, as if the real world existed in the depths and surface life was just a pale shadow of the rich, complex reality that existed beneath the waves. His research methods became increasingly unconventional as he tried to incorporate insights from his dreams into his scientific work. Hartley would spend hours floating in the ocean, attempting to recreate the sensory experiences of his whale dreams. He developed theories about sound and echolocation that were decades ahead of their time, based on his dream experiences of navigating through sound rather than sight. Hartley also began conducting experiments that seemed bizarre to his colleagues, but that produced remarkably accurate results. He would attempt to locate underwater objects or marine animals using acoustic cues that other scientists couldn't detect, predict the behavior of marine life based on environmental conditions that seemed unrelated to their activities, and identify the health status of marine organisms through observations that appeared to be based on intuition rather than scientific analysis. The dreams eventually faded in intensity, but they left Hartley permanently changed as both a scientist and a person. He became a passionate advocate for marine conservation, arguing that the oceans contained forms of life and intelligence that humans were only beginning to understand. His later work focused on trying to develop technology that could explore the deep ocean and verify the predictions he had made based on his whale dreams. Hartley established one of the first research programs dedicated to studying marine mammal intelligence. Decades before this became a recognized field of scientific inquiry. He developed techniques for observing whale behavior that anticipated modern marine biology methods, and he trained a generation of students who would later make major contributions to understanding ocean ecosystems. Professor Hartley lived until 1923, long enough to see the development of the first deep-sea exploration technology and the beginning of serious scientific investigation of deep ocean environments. When early underwater expeditions began discovering creatures and environments that matched his decades-old predictions, the scientific community began to take his theoretical work more seriously. Many of the deep-sea organisms that were discovered in the early 20th century have been described in remarkable detail in Hartley's 1876 papers. Giant squid, bioluminescent organisms, chemosynthetic bacteria, hydrothermal vent ecosystems. All of these had been predicted by Hartley with accuracy that seemed impossible given the limited technology and knowledge available to 19th century marine biology. In his final years, Hartley wrote a private memoir about his whale dreams that wasn't published until after his death. In it, he wrote, "I have spent my career trying to understand the ocean from the surface, like a man trying to understand a cathedral by examining pebbles from its foundation. The dreams showed me the vast architecture of the deep, the communities of consciousness that inhabit the abyss, the ancient wisdom that dwells in waters that have never known sunlight. Science measures what it can reach, but consciousness can travel to realms that instruments cannot penetrate. The whales know secrets that we are only beginning to glimpse, and they inhabit a world far stranger and more wonderful than we have dared to imagine." Dr. Sarah Chun was a marine mammal researcher at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography when she began experiencing dreams that would challenge everything the scientific community thought it understood about dolphin intelligence, communication, and the very nature of language itself. This was 1994, when researchers were just beginning to develop sophisticated methods for studying cetacean behavior using underwater microphones, computer analysis, and behavioral observation techniques that could provide insights into how dolphins actually lived in their natural environments. The scientific study of dolphin intelligence was still in its relative infancy in the 1990s. While researchers had established that dolphins were highly intelligent animals with complex social behaviors, most of what was known about dolphin communication came from observational studies that could document what dolphins did but couldn't explain what their vocalizations meant to them. It was like studying a foreign language by recording conversations without understanding the grammar, vocabulary, or cultural context that gave meaning to the sounds. Chion's research focused specifically on dolphin echolocation and acoustic communication using cutting-edge underwater recording equipment and computer analysis software to study the sounds that dolphins made in the wild. She was working with technology that represented the state-of-the-art for marine mammal research, directional hydrophones that could isolate individual dolphin vocalizations from background ocean noise, digital recording systems that could capture sounds across the full range of dolphin hearing, and computer programs that could analyze acoustic patterns for recurring structures that might indicate linguistic elements. But despite having access to the best available technology, Chion's research methods were still fundamentally limited by the fact that humans could only observe dolphin behavior from the outside. without any way to understand what their vocalizations actually communicated, or how their social interactions were organized from the dolphin's perspective. It was like trying to understand human conversation by analyzing sound frequencies without knowing what words meant or how grammar worked to organize meaning. Chun had spent 3 years collecting thousands of hours of dolphin vocalizations from wild populations off the California coast, building a database of acoustic recordings that represented one of the most comprehensive collections of cetacean communication data in the world. She had identified patterns and structures in dolphin sounds that suggested they were using far more sophisticated communication systems than previous researchers had recognized, but she hadn't been able to decode what these acoustic patterns actually meant. That changed in the summer of 1994, when Chen began having dreams where she was a bottlenose dolphin, swimming in complex social groups and participating in what could only be described as sophisticated conversations that used three-dimensional sound structures to convey information that far exceeded anything possible with human language. But these weren't dreams about swimming with dolphins or having friendly interactions with marine animals. They were detailed linguistic experiences where Chun understood dolphin communication as a form of language that operated according to principles that were completely alien to human speech, but that were internally consistent and incredibly rich in their ability to convey complex information. The first dream that Chun could remember clearly involved her swimming with a pod of about 12 dolphins in waters off Point Reyes, in an area where she had been conducting field research for several months. But instead of observing dolphin behavior from a boat or underwater observation platform, she was participating in dolphin social interactions as a member of the pod, understanding their vocalizations, not as mysterious animal sounds, but as articulate communication that was as clear and meaningful as human speech. In her dream, Chun could produce and understand dolphin vocalizations that carried layers of meaning that were impossible to achieve with human language. A single sound could simultaneously communicate location information with GPS-level precision, emotional state with subtlety that exceeded human emotional vocabulary, individual identity that included not just personal recognition but family history and social status, immediate intentions and longer-term plans, and references to shared experiences or cultural knowledge that connected current conversations to events that had occurred months or years earlier. What made these dream communications particularly remarkable was that they weren't just audio. They were three-dimensional acoustic sculptures that dolphins could read like complex texts. When a dolphin produced a vocalization, it wasn't just making a sound that carried meaning, it was creating a structured acoustic object in three-dimensional space that other dolphins could examine from different angles, analyze in detail, and respond to with their own three-dimensional sound constructions. Chun described these acoustic structures as being like holographic messages that could be rotated, magnified, and examined in detail to extract different types of information. A single dolphin call might contain a basic message that could be understood immediately, but it also contained embedded layers of additional information that could be accessed through more detailed acoustic analysis. It was like receiving a letter that was simultaneously a photograph, a map, a musical composition, and a mathematical equation, all encoded in a single sound structure. When Chin woke from these dreams, she retained detailed memories of specific dolphin conversations, including the acoustic patterns and the multiple layers of meaning they conveyed. She could remember not just what had been communicated, but how the three-dimensional sound structures had been organized to carry different types of information simultaneously, and how dolphins had manipulated these acoustic objects to create emphasis, convey emotions, and reference shared cultural knowledge. Chen began analyzing her field research data using insights from her dolphin dreams, looking for patterns that matched the communication structures she had experienced in her sleep. What she discovered revolutionized her understanding of dolphin intelligence and communication complexity. The vocalizations in her recordings contained far more structural sophistication than anyone had realized, layers of frequency modulation, harmonic relationships, and temporal patterns that suggested a form of syntax and grammar that was unlike anything in human language, but that was internally consistent and rule-governed. Using these new analytical approaches, Chen identified what appeared to be individual names that dolphins used to identify themselves and others. Acoustic signatures that were far more complex than the simple signature whistles that previous researchers had identified. These names included information about family relationships, social status, individual personality characteristics, and even biographical details that allowed dolphins to introduce themselves to strangers with remarkable specificity. Chen also discovered evidence of complex referential communication about objects and events that weren't immediately present in the dolphin's environment. Dolphins could discuss hunting strategies for prey species that weren't currently visible, coordinate complex group activities that would take place hours or days in the future, and share detailed information about environmental conditions in distant locations that individual dolphins had visited independently. Most remarkably, Chen identified what seemed to be cultural traditions that were passed down through dolphin communities from generation to generation. Different dolphin pods had distinct acoustic styles, specialized vocabularies for discussing local environmental conditions, and what appeared to be oral traditions that preserved information about historical events, seasonal patterns, and geographical features across decades or even centuries of dolphin cultural memory. Chen's research began attracting international attention as she published papers, describing dolphin communication systems that were far more advanced than any previous studies had suggested. Her methods for analyzing dolphin vocalizations were so innovative and her results so remarkable that other researchers initially struggled to replicate her findings, partly because Chen's insights seemed to come from an intuitive understanding of dolphin communication that was difficult to explain through conventional scientific methodology. The breakthrough that established Chen's credibility in the scientific community came when she began using her dream insights to predict dolphin behavior and communication patterns with remarkable accuracy. She could anticipate how dolphins would respond to specific acoustic stimuli, predict which individuals would participate in group vocalizations, forecast when dolphins were about to engage in complex cooperative behaviors like coordinated hunting or group childcare activities, and even anticipate when dolphin pods were planning to travel to new locations. These predictions proved accurate with consistency that provided empirical validation for insights that had originally come from her dreams. Chen's research began attracting funding from organizations that were interested in developing new approaches to understanding animal intelligence and consciousness, including the National Science Foundation, the Navy's Marine Mammal Research Program, and private foundations that supported innovative research into human-animal communication. But the dolphin dreams went beyond just language and communication. They also gave Chen insights into dolphin social behavior, intelligence, and consciousness that weren't available through traditional observation methods. She experienced dolphin emotions, problem-solving processes, and social relationships from the inside, gaining an understanding of cetacean psychology that no human researcher had ever achieved. Chen described dolphin consciousness as fundamentally different from human awareness, more fluid, more connected to immediate sensory experience, and more integrated with their acoustic environment. Dolphins didn't just hear sounds. They lived inside three-dimensional acoustic landscapes that they could manipulate and reshape through their vocalizations, creating shared experiential spaces that were as real and meaningful to them as physical environments were to humans. In her dreams, Chen experienced forms of dolphin emotion that had no direct human equivalents, feelings that were tied to acoustic harmony, social resonance, and three-dimensional spatial relationships in ways that human psychology couldn't directly access. Dolphins could experience joy through collective sound making that created acoustic patterns of remarkable beauty and complexity. They could feel sadness that was connected to acoustic dissonance when pod members were separated or when environmental noise interfered with their communication systems. The dreams also revealed aspects of dolphin culture that weren't visible through surface observation. Chen experienced teaching and learning processes where adult dolphins passed complex knowledge to younger ones through acoustic techniques that were far more sophisticated than simple imitation. Adult dolphins could create detailed acoustic models of hunting techniques, environmental conditions, or social behaviors that young dolphins could study, practice with, and gradually master through guided acoustic interaction. Chun also experienced what seemed to be artistic expression through collaborative sound creation. Dolphins working together to produce compositions that served no apparent practical purpose except aesthetic pleasure. These acoustic artworks were created through improvisation and collaboration that required remarkable musical sensitivity and social coordination, suggesting that dolphins had cultural activities that were analogous to human artistic expression, but that operated through sensory modalities that humans couldn't directly access. Chion's research methods became increasingly unconventional as she tried to bridge the gap between her dream insights and scientific methodology. She spent hours in the water with research dolphins, attempting to recreate the acoustic communication she had experienced in her dreams. She developed new underwater recording techniques that captured the three-dimensional structure of dolphin vocalizations in ways that previous technology couldn't achieve, and she pioneered methods for analyzing acoustic data that revealed structural patterns that had been invisible to earlier research approaches. The breakthrough that established Chun as one of the leading researchers in cetacean communication came when she successfully predicted specific dolphin behaviors based on acoustic analysis that used her dream-derived understanding of dolphin language structure. She could identify when dolphins were planning to hunt, when they were discussing environmental changes, when they were teaching skills to younger pod members, and when they were engaging in purely social or artistic acoustic activities. These predictions were verified through direct behavioral observation, providing empirical evidence that Chun's analytical methods were detecting genuine linguistic and cultural patterns rather than just random acoustic variation. Other researchers began adopting Chun's analytical techniques, and her insights began influencing the broader field of cetacean research in ways that advanced scientific understanding of marine mammal intelligence and communication. But the dolphin dreams came with personal costs that Chun documented in private journals. She began feeling increasingly disconnected from human social interactions, finding human language to be crude and limited compared to the multidimensional communication she had experienced as a dolphin. Human speech seemed one-dimensional and emotionally impoverished compared to the rich, three-dimensional acoustic communication that dolphins use to share complex thoughts and feelings. Chun developed what she called acoustic homesickness, a longing for the rich, three-dimensional sound environment that dolphins inhabited. Human environments seemed acoustically barren and socially isolated compared to the constant, complex communication that connected dolphin pod members in networks of shared awareness and mutual understanding. Chun also began experiencing physical changes that seemed related to her dolphin dreams. Her hearing became more acute, especially for high-frequency sounds and acoustic patterns that most humans couldn't detect. She developed an enhanced ability to navigate underwater and to hold her breath for extended periods, as if her human physiology was adapting to aquatic environments. Most remarkably, she began producing underwater vocalizations that other researchers couldn't identify as any known human sound, but that seemed to follow structural patterns similar to dolphin communication. Dr. Chen continued her dolphin communication research throughout the 1990s and into the 21st century, making discoveries that established her as one of the leading experts in cetacean intelligence and communication. Her work contributed to growing scientific recognition that dolphins possess forms of consciousness and communication abilities that rival human intelligence in complexity, even though they operate according to completely different principles and use sensory modalities that humans don't normally access. In 2003, Chan established the Institute for Interspecies Communication, focusing on developing methods for humans to communicate more effectively with dolphins and other cetaceans. Her research indicated that meaningful communication between humans and dolphins was theoretically possible, but it required humans to learn forms of three-dimensional acoustic communication that were completely different from human language. And that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of intelligence and consciousness. Dr. Chun's final published paper, released in 2019, was titled "Beyond the Surface: What Dolphin Dreams Taught Me About the Nature of Consciousness." In it, she wrote, "My research has convinced me that consciousness is not limited to human forms of awareness, and that intelligence can take forms we haven't imagined. The dream showed me that communication can transcend the boundaries we thought were absolute, and that other forms of consciousness might be far more sophisticated than we have ever recognized. We have barely begun to explore the forms of intelligence that share our planet, and we may never fully understand the richness of awareness that exists in forms of life that experience reality through sensory systems we can only dream of accessing. You know, not all animal transformation dreams involve dramatic life changes or scientific breakthroughs. Sometimes they're quieter, more personal experiences that nonetheless leave people fundamentally changed in ways that are harder to measure but no less profound. In 1892, a 12-year-old girl named Charlotte Pemberton living in London began having dreams where she experienced life as a street cat. And these dreams taught her lessons about survival, independence, and social observation that would shape her entire approach to life and eventually make her one of the most successful female journalists of the early 20th century. Charlotte lived with her wealthy family in a Mayfair townhouse, surrounded by servants, luxury, and all the privileges that came with being born into the upper reaches of Victorian society. Her father was a successful banker, her mother was devoted to charitable work and social climbing, and Charlotte was expected to follow the prescribed path for girls of her social class, to learn piano and painting, to speak French and German, to study literature and history, just enough to make intelligent conversation at dinner parties, and to eventually marry well and manage a household of her own. But Charlotte's cat dreams showed her a completely different way of being in the world, one that had nothing to do with social expectations, wealth, or the complex rules that governed Victorian society. In her dreams, she was a small tabby cat navigating the harsh realities of London's streets, learning to survive through her own intelligence, adaptability, and keen observation of the human world from a perspective that no respectable Victorian girl was supposed to have. The dreams began during a particularly cold winter when Charlotte was confined indoors for weeks due to illness. She had contracted pneumonia, which was often fatal for children in the 1890s, and spent months recovering in her bedroom while her worried parents consulted with the finest doctors in London. During this period of physical weakness and social isolation, Charlotte's mind began exploring forms of consciousness and experience that were completely outside her normal, privileged existence. In her first clear cat dream, Charlotte found herself in an alley behind a fashionable restaurant in Piccadilly, small and hungry and acutely aware that survival depended entirely on her own cunning and resourcefulness. But what was most remarkable about the dream wasn't the physical transformation. It was how naturally she adapted to processing the world through enhanced senses that revealed layers of information that human perception couldn't access. As a dream cat, Charlotte could identify people by their scent before she saw them, detecting not just individual identity but emotional states, recent activities, health conditions, and even social status through chemical signals that told stories about where people had been and what they had been doing. She could hear conversations through walls, detect the approach of people or animals from great distances, and navigate through complete darkness using whiskers that provided detailed information about spatial relationships and air currents. But the most transformative aspect of Charlotte's cat dreams was how they taught her to observe human society from the outside, as an invisible presence who could witness behavior that people thought was private or unobserved. As a dream cat, she learned to move through human spaces unseen, gathering information about how people really behaved when they thought no one was watching, understanding social dynamics and power relationships that were hidden from normal social interaction. Victorian society was built on elaborate social performances where people's public behavior often bore little relationship to their private thoughts, feelings, or actions. But cats could slip through the cracks of this social theater, observing servants gossiping about their employers, businessmen making deals they wouldn't want their wives to know about, society ladies revealing their true opinions about friends and rivals when they thought they were alone. In her dreams, Charlotte developed an understanding of human nature that was far more sophisticated and cynical than anything a sheltered 12-year-old from a wealthy family should have possessed. She learned to read facial expressions, body language, and vocal tones in ways that revealed when people were lying, when they were afraid, when they were angry but trying to hide it, and when their public personas were masks that concealed completely different private realities. When Charlotte recovered from her illness and returned to normal social life, she retained these observational skills and social instincts. She could read people's motivations and emotional states with remarkable accuracy, often understanding family dynamics, social tensions, and hidden conflicts that other people missed entirely. She could move through social situations almost invisibly, gathering information and understanding interpersonal relationships that escaped the attention of adults who were focused on their own social performances. Charlotte's parents initially attributed her new perceptiveness to the maturity that often comes from surviving a serious illness, but her abilities went far beyond normal childhood development. She could predict how people would behave in specific situations, anticipate conflicts before they became obvious, and understand the complex web of relationships, rivalries, and alliances that shaped her family's social world. More importantly, Charlotte's cat dreams had taught her a form of independence and self-reliance that was completely contrary to Victorian expectations for girls of her social class. In her dreams, survival had depended entirely on her own intelligence, courage, and adaptability. There were no servants to take care of her needs, no parents to protect her from danger, no social safety net to catch her if she made mistakes. She had learned to trust her own judgment, to think strategically about challenges and opportunities, and to take action based on her own assessment of situations rather than deferring to authority figures. These qualities served Charlotte well as she grew older, and began to chafe against the restrictions and expectations that Victorian society placed on young women. While other girls her age were being trained to be decorative and dependent, Charlotte was developing skills and confidence that would allow her to make her own way in the world. At 16, Charlotte shocked her family by announcing that she wanted to become a journalist rather than preparing for marriage and domestic life. This was 1896, when respectable women didn't have careers, and female journalists were considered scandalous figures who had abandoned proper feminine roles. But Charlotte had learned from her cat dreams that survival often required doing things that were considered inappropriate or dangerous, and that independence was worth more than social approval. Charlotte's cat-derived abilities proved invaluable in her journalistic career. Her skill at moving through social situations without being noticed allowed her to gather information that was inaccessible to other reporters. She could attend social events, political meetings, and business gatherings, observing and listening while remaining essentially invisible to the powerful men who controlled access to information. Her ability to read people's true motivations and emotional states made her an extraordinarily effective interviewer. She could tell when sources were lying, when they were holding back important information, and when they were ready to reveal secrets that they had been protecting. She developed techniques for encouraging people to talk about subjects they had intended to keep private, often by creating environments where they felt safe enough to drop their social masks and reveal their authentic thoughts and feelings. Charlotte became one of the first successful female investigative journalists, specializing in exposing social problems that were hidden from public view. Her ability to observe human behavior with cat-like precision, combined with her talent for moving through different social environments without being noticed or remembered, made her uniquely effective at uncovering stories that other journalists couldn't access. She wrote groundbreaking articles about working conditions in factories where women and children labored in dangerous conditions for starvation wages. She exposed political corruption by observing meetings and conversations that politicians assumed were private. She documented the lives of people living in London's slums, gathering information that challenged comfortable assumptions about poverty and social responsibility. Charlotte's journalistic success was built on skills she had learned in dreams about being a stray cat in Victorian London, but she never spoke publicly about the source of her abilities. In the rational, scientific atmosphere of the early 20th century, Claiming that professional skills had been acquired through animal dreams would have destroyed her credibility and ended her career. Instead, Charlotte became known for her almost supernatural ability to be in the right place at the right time, to ask the right questions, and to understand human nature in ways that allowed her to reveal truths that other people wanted to keep hidden. She developed a reputation as someone who could uncover any story, no matter how carefully it was concealed, and who could convince anyone to talk about subjects they had sworn to keep secret. Charlotte continued her journalistic career for over 40 years, becoming one of the most respected and influential journalists of her generation. She never married, maintaining the independence that her cat dreams had taught her to value above social conformity or security. She died in 1954, leaving behind a body of work that had helped expose social injustices and hold powerful people accountable for their actions. In 1704, a Tibetan Buddhist monk named Tenzin began having dreams where he was a snow leopard hunting in the high Himalayas, and these experiences revolutionized his approach to meditation and spiritual practice in ways that influenced Tibetan Buddhism for generations. Tenzin had spent years trying to achieve the state of single-pointed concentration that Buddhist texts described as necessary for advanced meditation, but his human mind was constantly distracted by thoughts, emotions, and physical discomforts that prevented him from achieving the deep focus that his practice required. Tenzin lived in a monastery perched on a cliff face at an altitude of nearly 14,000 feet, where the air was so thin that physical exertion became difficult and the cold was so intense that meditation sessions were often interrupted by the body's desperate attempts to generate warmth. The monastery was home to about 30 monks who had dedicated their lives to achieving enlightenment through rigorous spiritual practice, but even the most experienced meditators struggled with the mental restlessness and physical discomfort that seemed to be inherent in human consciousness. The snow leopard dreams began during a particularly challenging winter retreat, when Tenzin was attempting to maintain continuous meditation for weeks at a time. The practice required sitting motionless for hours while maintaining perfect awareness and concentration, but Tenzin found that his mind was constantly pulled away from meditation by physical sensations, wandering thoughts, emotional reactions, and the endless internal chatter that seemed to be an unavoidable part of human consciousness. In his dreams, Tenzin experienced a completely different form of consciousness, one that was capable of absolute, unwavering focus during hunting, combined with complete relaxation and presence during rest. As a dream snow leopard, Tenzin learned what it was like to have a mind that could be totally absorbed in immediate sensory experience without the constant mental commentary that plagued his human meditation practice. The snow leopard's hunting consciousness became a template for meditation that Tenzin incorporated into his spiritual practice. He learned to achieve the patient, focused awareness of a predator waiting for prey, a state of relaxed alertness that could be maintained for hours without mental fatigue or distraction. He also experienced a complete acceptance and presence that allowed the snow leopard to rest fully between hunting sessions, without anxiety about the future or regret about the past. Snow leopards are among the most patient and focused hunters in the animal kingdom, capable of stalking prey for days across treacherous mountain terrain and waiting motionlessly for hours in freezing temperatures for the perfect moment to strike. In his dreams, Tenzin learned to embody this same quality of patient awareness, developing forms of concentration that far exceeded anything he had achieved through traditional meditation techniques. These techniques proved so effective that Tenzin began teaching them to other monks, developing a form of meditation practice that used animal consciousness as a model for achieving spiritual states. His methods spread throughout Tibetan Buddhist communities and became part of the traditional practices that are still used today, though few practitioners know that these techniques originated from a monk's dreams about being a snow leopard hunting in the Himalayas. Miriam was an Aboriginal elder of the Yolku people whose eagle dreams connected her to the ancestral knowledge of her people in ways that preserved cultural traditions during a time when European colonization was threatening to destroy indigenous knowledge systems that had been maintained for thousands of years. Her dreams began during a period when traditional Aboriginal life was under extreme pressure from European settlement, when many of the sacred sites, seasonal gathering places, and cultural practices that had sustained her people since time immemorial were being disrupted or destroyed by forces that seemed as unstoppable as natural disasters. The Oku people had lived in what is now Arnhem Land in northern Australia for over 65,000 years, developing one of the world's most sophisticated systems for understanding and managing complex ecosystems. Their culture was based on intricate relationships between people, land, animals, plants, and spiritual forces that were encoded in stories, songs, ceremonies, and seasonal practices that connected every aspect of daily life to deeper patterns of meaning and responsibility. But by 1823, European diseases, violence, and economic disruption were threatening the survival of Aboriginal communities throughout Australia. Traditional food sources were being depleted or made inaccessible. Sacred sites were being desecrated by settlers who didn't understand their cultural significance. And young people were being separated from elders who could teach them the complex knowledge systems that had allowed Aboriginal people to thrive in challenging environments for millennia. Miriam had been designated as a keeper of women's knowledge, sacred information about seasonal cycles, plant medicine, water sources, and spiritual practices that could only be shared among women and that was essential for the survival and cultural continuity of her people. But the disruption caused by European colonization was making it increasingly difficult to pass this knowledge to younger generations in traditional ways. In her dreams, Miriam flew as an eagle over the landscape, observing the country from perspectives that revealed the deeper spiritual geography of her people's homeland. She could see the songlines, the invisible paths across the land that connected sacred sites and carried the stories of the ancestors, the dreaming tracks that recorded the journeys of ancestral beings, who had created the landscape and established the laws that governed relationships between all living things. As a dream eagle, Miriam could understand how the landscape held cultural memory and ancestral knowledge in ways that weren't visible from ground level. She could see the connections between different sacred sites, understand the seasonal movements that connected scattered water sources and food areas, and perceive the spiritual relationships that linked human communities to particular places, animals and plants in ways that created responsibilities and obligations that extended across generations. These eagle dreams allowed Miriam to preserve and pass down traditional knowledge that might otherwise have been lost during the catastrophic disruption of colonization. She could guide younger generations to sacred sites that were becoming difficult to locate as traditional travel patterns were disrupted, teach them about seasonal patterns and ecological relationships that were encoded in the landscape itself, and help them understand spiritual connections that were essential for maintaining cultural identity and environmental stewardship responsibilities. Miriam's eagle dreams became a way of maintaining cultural continuity during a period when traditional knowledge transmission was being severely disrupted by the social and environmental chaos of colonization. The knowledge she preserved through her dreams helped her community maintain essential cultural practices and environmental management, techniques that allowed them to survive and adapt during one of the most challenging periods in Aboriginal history. You know, throughout most of human history, the idea that people could temporarily experience life through animal consciousness wasn't considered strange or supernatural. It was considered a normal part of how consciousness worked, and an important source of practical knowledge and spiritual insight. Indigenous cultures around the world developed sophisticated understandings of what anthropologists call shape-shifting consciousness, the ability of human awareness to temporarily inhabit different forms of perception and experience. These weren't considered magical abilities, but natural capacities that all humans possessed, but that required training and preparation to access safely. In many Native American traditions, vision quests and dream journeys, where people experienced life as animals, were considered essential parts of education and spiritual development. Young people would undergo specific preparations, fasting, meditation, isolation in natural settings, that made it more likely for them to have dreams where they experienced life through animal consciousness. But these weren't random experiences. Indigenous cultures understood that different animals provided different types of knowledge and wisdom. Eagle consciousness taught about vision and perspective, seeing the big picture and understanding long-term patterns. Wolf consciousness taught about pack cooperation, loyalty, and effective group hunting strategies. Bear consciousness taught about strength, protection, and the balance between aggression and nurturing. The Inuit cultures of the Arctic developed particularly sophisticated understandings of animal consciousness dreams, because survival in extreme environments required knowledge and abilities that were beyond normal human capacities. Shamans would deliberately cultivate dreams where they experienced life as polar bears, seals, whales, and other Arctic animals, gathering survival information that could mean the difference between life and death for their communities. What's fascinating about these traditional approaches is that they recognize the practical, educational value of animal consciousness experiences. These weren't just spiritual adventures, they were ways of acquiring real-world knowledge and skills that couldn't be learned through normal human experience. African traditional healing systems also incorporated animal consciousness as a source of medical knowledge. Healers would have dreams where they experienced life as various animals, learning about medicinal plants, diagnostic techniques, and treatment methods that had been refined through millions of years of animal evolution. Ancient Egyptian culture took dream experiences very seriously, and they had extensive systems for understanding and interpreting dreams that involved animal transformations. The Egyptians believed that during sleep, the spiritual double could travel through time and space, experiencing different forms of consciousness and gathering information that wasn't available to the waking mind. Egyptian dream temples were essentially ancient sleep research centers, where people would go specifically to have meaningful dreams. These temples had specialized priests who understood how to prepare people for transformative dream experiences, and they kept detailed records of dreams and their outcomes that represented some of the world's first systematic studies of consciousness during sleep. Greek and Roman cultures also recognized the significance of animal transformation dreams, though they approached them somewhat differently than indigenous shamanic traditions. Greek philosophers like Aristotle and Plato wrote about dreams as windows into different forms of consciousness, suggesting that the sleeping mind could access knowledge and perspectives that were unavailable to normal waking awareness. The Greeks developed detailed systems for interpreting dreams that involved animals, understanding that these experiences could provide insights into health, relationships, future events, and spiritual development. They saw animal dreams as communications from the gods, messages that required careful interpretation, but that could provide valuable guidance for important decisions. Medieval European culture had a more ambivalent relationship with animal transformation dreams. On one hand, Christian theology was suspicious of experiences that seemed to involve consciousness, leaving the human body or taking on non-human forms. On the other hand, medieval scholars recognized that these experiences were too common and too meaningful to be dismissed entirely. Medieval monasteries developed sophisticated approaches to understanding unusual dream experiences, including dreams that involved animal consciousness. They created frameworks for distinguishing between dreams that came from divine sources, dreams that resulted from natural psychological processes, and dreams that might be influenced by demonic forces. What's interesting is that medieval religious communities often found ways to integrate animal consciousness experiences into Christian spiritual practice, as we saw with Brother Thomas's Wolf dreams. They developed techniques for maintaining human moral consciousness while experiencing non-human forms of awareness, treating these experiences as opportunities for spiritual growth rather than as threats to human identity. The scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries led to a major shift in how Western culture understood consciousness and dreams. The mechanistic worldview that emerged during this period viewed consciousness as something that was strictly limited to individual human brains, and it dismissed experiences that seemed to involve consciousness operating outside normal physical constraints. This scientific skepticism about non-ordinary states of consciousness persisted well into the 20th century, when most researchers assumed that dreams were just random neural activity that didn't contain meaningful information about external reality. The idea that dreams could provide access to knowledge or abilities that weren't available through normal sensory experience was considered unscientific and irrational. But modern neuroscience and psychology have begun to develop more sophisticated understandings of consciousness and dreaming that suggest the traditional dismissal of unusual dream experiences might have been premature. Research into lucid dreaming, sleep and memory consolidation, and the neural basis of consciousness has revealed that the sleeping brain is far more active and complex than previously thought. Studies have shown that dreams play important roles in memory consolidation, emotional processing, problem solving, and creative insight. The sleeping brain doesn't just replay random fragments of daily experience. It actively reorganizes information, makes new connections, and sometimes arrives at solutions to problems that the waking mind couldn't solve. Modern sleep research has also revealed that consciousness during dreaming is far more sophisticated than the old view of dreams as meaningless neural noise. REM sleep involves complex patterns of brain activity that can be as intense and organized as waking consciousness, suggesting that dream experiences might be more meaningful and informative than mainstream science has traditionally recognized. Carl Jung, the pioneering psychiatrist, developed theories about dreams that were much more compatible with traditional indigenous understandings. Jung suggested that dreams could provide access to what he called the collective unconscious, shared patterns of human experience that were encoded in the structure of the psyche itself. According to Jungian theory, dreams about animal transformations might represent the activation of archetypal patterns that connect individual consciousness to broader forms of awareness that are shared across all human experience. Animal archetypes in dreams could represent instinctual knowledge, survival wisdom, and forms of consciousness that are more fundamental than the rational, ego-based awareness that dominates waking life. Contemporary research into consciousness has revealed that awareness is far more flexible and expandable than previous scientific models suggested. Studies of meditation, psychedelic experiences, and various altered states of consciousness have shown that human awareness can access forms of information and perspective that aren't available through normal sensory channels. Some researchers have begun investigating whether consciousness might be able to access information through what they call non-local awareness, forms of perception that aren't limited by the normal constraints of space and time. While this research is still controversial, it suggests that experiences like prophetic dreams or animal consciousness might involve genuine expansions of awareness rather than just psychological fantasies. Modern ecology and animal behavior research has also revealed that animal consciousness is far more sophisticated than previous scientific models suggested. Animals demonstrate complex problem-solving abilities, sophisticated communication systems, cultural transmission of knowledge, and forms of awareness that challenge traditional assumptions about the uniqueness of human consciousness. If animal consciousness is more complex and intelligent than we previously recognized, then it becomes more plausible that human consciousness might be able to access animal forms of awareness through dreams or other altered states. The boundaries between different forms of consciousness might be more permeable than we've traditionally assumed. What's particularly interesting is how modern scientific discoveries often validate insights that traditional cultures developed thousands of years ago. Indigenous understandings of animal consciousness, ecological relationships, and the flexibility of human awareness are being confirmed by contemporary research in ways that suggest traditional knowledge systems might have been far more accurate than Western science initially recognized. Perhaps the most honest scientific position is that we still don't fully understand the nature of consciousness, dreams, or the relationship between mind and reality. The experiences we've explored tonight challenge our assumptions about the boundaries of human awareness and the nature of knowledge itself, reminding us that consciousness might be far stranger and more wonderful than we usually dare to imagine. Before we drift off into whatever dreams await us tonight, let me share a few lesser-known stories about prophetic dreams that most people have never heard. Stories that are somehow even stranger than the famous cases everyone knows about, and that suggests the relationship between human consciousness and animal awareness might be even more mysterious than we've imagined. In 1923, a Swiss clockmaker named Klaus Weber started having the same dream every night for 6 months. In the dream, he was standing in his workshop when all of his clocks suddenly stopped working at exactly 3:17 a.m. Then he would hear a voice saying, "Time has run out for the clockmaker." Now, Klaus wasn't just any ordinary craftsman. He was considered one of the finest clockmakers in all of Switzerland, a man whose timepieces were so precise and beautiful that wealthy collectors from across Europe would travel to his small workshop in the Alps just to commission a single clock. But this dream was unlike anything Klaus had ever experienced. Every night, without fail, he would find himself standing in his familiar workshop, surrounded by the gentle ticking and chiming of his beloved clocks. But then, always at exactly 3:17 a.m., according to every clock in the workshop, something impossible would happen. Every single timepiece would suddenly stop working simultaneously, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt like death itself. Weber was so disturbed by this recurring dream that he documented it in his journal every day, noting any variations or new details with the same precision he brought to his clockmaking. The consistency of the dream began to unnerve Klaus in ways he couldn't explain. He was a man of routine and precision, but this level of repetition felt unnatural, almost mechanical, as if his subconscious mind was stuck in some kind of temporal loop. 6 months later, Klaus Weber died of a heart attack at exactly 3:17 a.m., surrounded by hundreds of clocks that had all mysteriously stopped working at the precise moment of his death. His assistants found him the next morning, sitting peacefully at his workbench, as if he had simply fallen asleep while working. But every single clock in the workshop had stopped at 3:17, and none of them could be restarted, no matter what the repair experts tried. Then there's the case of Timothy Mitchell, a 7-year-old boy in Yorkshire, England, who in 1962 started telling his parents about his future memories experiences that he described as remembering things that had already happened, but that nobody else remembered because they hadn't happened yet. Timothy's way of describing these experiences was so matter-of-fact and innocent that it took his parents weeks to understand that their son was having what appeared to be prophetic visions with remarkable accuracy. Timothy would wake up in the morning and casually mention things like, "I remember when grandfather dies next spring," or "I remember the day when we get the new red car." When his parents asked him what he meant, Timothy would explain that he had dreams where he could see things that were going to happen. But in the dreams, it felt like he was remembering events that had already occurred. Timothy's future memories were incredibly specific and detailed. He described technological advances that wouldn't be invented for decades. He talked about people carrying small computers in their pockets that could show moving pictures and connect them to anyone in the world. He described watching movies on flat screens that hung on walls like pictures, and cars that could drive themselves without any person steering them. But Timothy also made predictions about smaller, more immediate events that his parents could verify. He predicted the exact date his grandfather would die March 15, 1963, and described details about the funeral that proved accurate down to what flowers would be in the arrangements and who would attend the service. He predicted the day his baby sister would be born, several months before his mother even knew she was pregnant, and correctly described the complications that would occur during the delivery. As Timothy grew older, his future memories became less frequent and less detailed. By the time he was 10 years old, the prophetic experiences had mostly stopped, and by age 12, they had disappeared entirely. Timothy himself didn't seem troubled by the loss of this ability. If anything, he seemed relieved to have his dreams return to normal childhood concerns like adventures and fantasies, rather than glimpses of future realities. In 1958, a Spanish artist named Maria Consuela began having dreams where she painted disasters before they happened. But these weren't just vague premonitions. She would dream that she was creating specific paintings of earthquakes, floods, fires, and accidents with such detailed accuracy that the completed artwork served as precise predictions of tragedies that wouldn't occur for months or years. Maria lived in a small coastal village where she supported herself by painting portraits and landscapes for tourists. She had never had any prophetic experiences before, and she wasn't particularly interested in supernatural phenomena. But every few months, Maria would have intensely vivid dreams about disasters, earthquakes that split the earth open like broken pottery, Floods that swept away entire towns, fires that consumed forests and cities with equal hunger. When these disaster dreams came to her, Maria would wake up with an overwhelming compulsion to paint exactly what she had seen. She would stumble from her bed to her easel, sometimes still wearing her nightgown, and begin painting with an intensity and skill that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her normal artistic abilities. She would work for hours without stopping, as if channeling visions from some other realm directly onto her canvas. Maria's disaster paintings were remarkably detailed and technically accomplished, far beyond what anyone expected from a village artist who had never received formal training. She painted specific buildings burning in cities she had never visited, bridges collapsing over rivers she had never seen, ships sinking in storms that showed weather patterns with meteorological accuracy. The paintings showed not just the disasters themselves, but the human stories within them, specific people fleeing from danger, families separated in chaos, rescuers working desperately to save lives. Maria would paint faces with such precision that they seemed like portraits of real individuals, even though she claimed never to have met any of the people who appeared in her disaster visions. Maria's final painting, completed in 1961, showed a massive flood destroying her own village. She showed this painting to her neighbors and begged them to prepare for a flood that would be unlike anything they had ever experienced. She warned them about which areas would be hit hardest, which escape routes would be safe, and when they should evacuate based on the weather patterns she had seen in her dream. 3 months after Maria completed her final painting, an unexpected dam failure in the mountains above their village caused massive flooding that destroyed most of the town exactly as she had depicted. The disaster played out like a live-action version of her painting. The same buildings were submerged, the same escape routes proved safe, and even specific details like which trees would be uprooted and where debris would accumulate matched her artistic vision with impossible precision. However, because Maria had warned the villagers and some had taken her advice seriously, most people were prepared and evacuated to safety before the worst flooding occurred. Lives were saved because an artist had dreamed about tomorrow and painted what she saw, and because some people had learned to trust in the possibility that art could sometimes serve as prophecy. There's also the mysterious case of the future library dreams that occurred in the 1970s, when several different authors in different parts of the world started having dreams about visiting a vast library filled with books that hadn't been written yet. These authors, who didn't know each other and lived thousands of miles apart, all described the same impossible place in their dreams, with such consistent detail that researchers eventually began to suspect they were accessing some kind of shared unconscious space. Margaret Thornton, a novelist living in Edinburgh, was the first to write publicly about these experiences. In 1973, she published an article describing recurring dreams where she would find herself in an enormous library with shelves that stretched upward beyond reach, filled with millions of books that contained stories no one had written yet. The library was illuminated by a soft, sourceless light that made reading comfortable without creating shadows. In Margaret's dreams, she could pull books from the shelves and read complete novels, poetry collections, and plays that wouldn't be published for years or decades. The books were perfectly formed. They had detailed plots, fully developed characters, and writing styles that were distinctively different from each other, as if they had been created by hundreds of different authors from different time periods and cultural backgrounds. Within months of Margaret's article being published, other writers began coming forward with similar experiences. A poet named Carlos Mendez in Mexico City described visiting the same library in his dreams, identifying it by specific architectural details that matched Margaret's description perfectly. A playwright named Hiroshi Tanaka in Tokyo reported dream visits to an identical library, where he had read entire theatrical works that wouldn't be written for decades. The phenomenon became even more mysterious when these authors started discovering connections between their dream experiences and real-world publishing events. Margaret had read a complete science fiction novel in the dream library about time travelers who could only move backward through history, never forward. 3 years later, a debut author published a novel with an almost identical plot, claiming it was entirely original work that had come to him through dreams. Similar incidents began occurring with other authors who reported library dreams. Carlos found that poems he had read in the dream library were later published by poets he had never heard of, with only minor variations in wording and structure. Hiroshi discovered that plays he had witnessed in the library were later produced by theater companies, written by playwrights who claimed the works were entirely original. The library dreams gradually stopped happening for most of the writers who had experienced them, as if they had been given temporary access to some cosmic repository of future creativity and then returned to relying on their individual imagination and inspiration. But the writers who had visited the library reported that the experience permanently changed their understanding of creativity and the source of artistic inspiration. These obscure cases suggest that the relationship between consciousness, time, and reality might be far stranger than we usually assume. Whether these experiences represent genuine glimpses into future events, sophisticated unconscious pattern recognition, or something else entirely, they remind us that human awareness might be capable of things that challenge our most basic assumptions about the nature of mind and reality. If you're somehow still awake, which honestly surprises me at this point, you've just journeyed with me through some of the most fascinating cases of people who dreamed they were animals and woke up fundamentally changed by the experience. From medieval monks who learned to hunt like wolves, to Renaissance artists who understood flight through bird consciousness, to modern researchers who cracked the code of dolphin, communication through dreams that let them swim in pods and speak in three-dimensional sound. These stories challenge everything we think we know about the boundaries between human and animal consciousness, between dreaming and reality, between individual awareness and the vast intelligence that exists in forms of life we barely understand. They suggest that consciousness might be far more flexible, far more expandable, and far more connected to other forms of awareness than we usually dare to imagine. What I find most remarkable about these cases is that they weren't just psychological experiences, they led to real-world knowledge, abilities, and insights that changed people's lives and sometimes changed our understanding of the world itself. Brother Thomas became a legendary tracker who could navigate like a Volf while maintaining the soul of a saint. Leonardo da Vinci developed theories about flight that were centuries ahead of their time. Dr. Sarah Chun revolutionized our understanding of dolphin intelligence. These weren't just interesting dreams. They were transformative encounters with forms of consciousness that taught humans things we couldn't learn any other way. Maybe tonight, as you drift off to sleep, you'll find yourself experiencing the world through senses that are sharper, older, and wilder than anything in human experience. Maybe you'll run through forests on four legs, soar above mountains on wings that catch thermals you can feel but not see, or dive to ocean depths where the pressure would crush a human body, but feels like coming home to something ancient and true. And if you do have one of those dreams where you wake up feeling like you've lived another life, like you've touched some form of consciousness that was both completely alien and strangely familiar, don't dismiss it too quickly. Our ancestors understood that dreams can be teachers, guides, and windows into forms of wisdom that exist beyond the boundaries of human knowledge. I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Drop your location in the comments. And if you're brave enough, share any dreams you've had where you experience life as something other than human. These stories remind us that consciousness is far stranger and more wonderful than we usually allow ourselves to believe, and that the line between dreaming and reality might be more blurred than we think. Sweet dreams, fellow travelers. May your sleep be peaceful, your dreams be meaningful, and your consciousness be open to whatever wisdom awaits in the mysterious realm where human awareness meets, the vast intelligence that flows through all living things. See you in your dreams.